You're standing at your stove, a pot of water rolling to a boil, and in your other hand a plain roll of white toilet paper. You start feeding it in, sheet after sheet, and it turns to gray mush. Looks like a waste. It isn't. Because what comes out of that pot, once you dry it right, will burn hotter and longer than the firewood you paid good money for this winter. That is the answer I chased for the better part of 2 years, and it turned everything I thought I knew about heating a home upside down. The old men in these mountains weren't wasting paper when they did this. They were making fuel. Free heat, pulled out of the one thing every single house throws in the trash without a second thought. My grandfather did it in a one-room cabin outside Cripple Creek, Colorado, and, I spent a long time thinking he'd just gone a little strange in his old age. I was wrong. Stay with me. Because the last piece of this puzzle didn't come from him. It came from a homestead manual printed in 1884 and a fuel shortage during the First World War that almost nobody talks about anymore. And by the time we're done, you'll be able to do this in your own kitchen this weekend with a pot and a bucket you already own. Let me tell you how I got here. It started with a memory I couldn't shake. I was maybe 9 years old, sitting on the floor of my grandfather's cabin, and he had a big cast iron pot on the wood stove. Not cooking, not laundry. He was tearing paper into it, newspaper, brown sacks, and yes, toilet paper, and stirring it like a witch over a cauldron. I asked him what he was doing, and he just said, "Making winter." That was it, making winter. For years I thought that was nonsense, an old man's habit. But when he passed, I found a wooden crate in his shed full of gray bricks, hard as pottery, light as cork. I tossed one in the stove out of curiosity, and that single brick, no bigger than my fist, burned steady for close to 2 hours. 2 hours, from garbage. That's when I knew I'd missed something. And that's when the digging began. The first thing I had to understand was why. Why boil it? Why not just wad up dry paper and burn it? Anybody who's ever tossed a paper towel in a fireplace knows what happens. It flares up bright, it's gone in 15 seconds, and it does nothing to warm the room. Dry paper is flash and no substance. So I started reading. Old trail manuals, homestead journals, anything I could get my hands on. And I kept running into the same idea from men who lived hard winters with no money and no coal delivery. The trick was never the paper. The trick was the water. When you boil paper and mash it into pulp, you break down the fibers and let them lock back together as they dry. It stops being a loose, airy sheet full of gaps. It becomes dense, compressed. And density is everything when it comes to burning something slow. A dry sheet of paper is mostly air, and air makes it burn fast and cold. A dried pulp brick is packed tight, so the fire has to work its way through it inch by inch, the same way a hardwood log outlasts a handful of twigs. I tested it in my own wood stove that first winter. A loose double handful of dry newspaper burned out in under 2 minutes and barely moved the thermometer on my wall. One pulp brick made from that exact same amount of paper burned over an hour and a half and put real heat into the room. Same paper, same fire. The only difference was that pot of boiling water. That should have been the end of it. A neat little trick. But it wasn't, because a question started nagging at me that I couldn't answer. If this works so well, and it costs nothing, and it uses what every home already throws away, why in the world did nobody teach me this? Why did I have to find gray bricks in a dead man's shed to even learn it existed? That question is where this stopped being a hobby and started feeling like something had been taken. Because the deeper I dug, the more it looked like this knowledge didn't just fade on its own. Somebody had a reason to let it die. Here's the first crack in the story. I went looking for where the method came from, and the trail led me straight back to the poorest, most self-reliant people this country ever produced. Mountain families, homesteaders, and the frontier trappers who couldn't afford to waste a scrap of anything. In the old book Woodcraft, written by George Washington Sears in 1884, a man who went by the pen name Nessmuk, there's a whole philosophy about the woods providing for the man who pays. Attention! Sears weighed everything he carried down to the ounce because he was a small, sickly man who couldn't haul a heavy pack. He was obsessed with getting the most heat, the most use, out of the least material. And that same thinking ran through every mountain cabin I ever read about. Nothing wasted, everything twice used. Now here's the part that got my blood up. During the First World War, and again in the hard years that followed, coal and firewood got scarce and expensive in a hurry. Families in the mountains and the poor parts of the cities went right back to this old pulp trick to keep from freezing. They soaked their paper waste, mashed it, packed it, and dried it into what they called paper bricks or paper logs. There are county records and old household bulletins from that era that describe folks heating whole rooms on nothing but garbage and water. And it worked so well that decades later, agricultural extension offices at land-grant universities actually studied it. They ran the numbers on newspaper and paper logs and found that tightly compressed paper, dried properly, carries a heat value in the same neighborhood as soft wood. Think about that. The stuff you pay someone to haul away burns about as well as a log you'd pay $40 or $50 a rack for. So I had my history. The method was real, it was proven, and it came from exactly the kind of stubborn, broke, do-it-yourself people this whole tradition honors. But that only made the nagging question louder. If universities confirmed it, and poor families lived on it, why did it vanish from everyday life so completely that a grown man raised in these mountains never heard of it? I found the beginning of an answer, and I didn't like it one bit. Here's what I started to see. Somewhere in the middle of the last century, heating your home stopped being something you did and became something you bought. Furnaces, gas lines, electric heat, monthly bills. A whole system got built where the warmth in your house flows through a meter that somebody else owns and reads. And a family that can heat a room with a pot of water and a trash bag full of junk mail is a family that doesn't need that meter quite so bad. I'm not going to sit here and tell you a single man in a suit somewhere decided to erase this trick. That's not how it works. What happens is quieter and, honestly, worse. When there's no money to be made teaching people to be self-reliant, nobody teaches it. The magazines that used to run these household tricks got fat on advertising from the very companies selling furnaces and fuel. The extension pamphlets got quietly shelved. And within a generation or two, a skill that kept families alive through 2 wars and a depression just slipped out of the conversation. Not banned, just abandoned, because it didn't sell anything. That's the thing about the most valuable old skills. They don't disappear because they stopped working. They disappear because somebody figured out how to charge you for the alternative. And once I understood that, I started paying attention to every dollar leaving my house for heat, and it made me sick. If you've been feeling that same pull, the sense that there's a whole shelf of this buried knowledge you were never handed, I put the deepest research from this 2-year dig into a book called Mountain Roots. It's the written record of everything I tracked down. The ratios, the sourcing, the old accounts, and the other lost methods from these mountains that never made it to video. There's also a more complete edition called Mountain Complete for those who want the full picture in one place. You'll find the details in the description below. The average home in this country spends hundreds of dollars a year just to stay warm through the cold months, and a good chunk of that is going up the chimney in the form of fuel we could partly replace with what we already toss out. But here's where my investigation hit a wall. Because I could make the bricks, and I could prove they burned, but my early batches were a mess. They took forever to dry. Some of them crumbled, some barely lit. I knew the old-timers had solved these problems because those bricks in my grandfather's crate were near perfect. So I had to figure out what I was still missing, and the answer turned out to be hiding in the ratio. Now, I know exactly what some of you are thinking right about now. You're thinking this is fine for a man with a wood stove and a shed and a pile of firewood, but you live in a normal house, in town, maybe an apartment, and you don't have a stove to burn anything in. You're thinking this doesn't apply to you. I need you to stay right here, because this next part is built for exactly your kitchen and your life, and it might be the most useful thing in this whole story. Here's the truth I found. You do not need a wood stove to get value out of this. What you're really learning here is how to turn free waste into fuel, and that fuel works in more places than you'd guess. A backyard fire pit, a charcoal grill on a cold evening, a little emergency heater, a camp stove, a fireplace you almost never use because logs got so expensive. And most important of all, this is the thing you make now and set on a shelf so that when the power goes out in an ice storm and the whole neighborhood goes dark and cold, you are the one house with a way to boil water and warm a room. And here is how you do it this week, with what's already under your sink. Take a 5-gallon bucket, the kind you can buy for a few dollars or get free behind any hardware store. Fill it about halfway with warm water. Now start feeding in your paper waste. Junk mail, the cardboard from cereal boxes torn small, newspaper, paper, egg cartons, and yes, the cardboard tubes and paper you'd otherwise flush or throw away. Let it soak overnight. By morning it's soft. You don't even have to boil it if you're patient, but here's where my grandfather's pot comes back in. If you heat that water first, even just hot from the tap, and better yet, if you simmer a batch of it on the stove, the fibers break down far faster and far more completely. The heat is what turns a bucket of soggy trash into a smooth, heavy pulp that packs tight and burns slow. Cold soaking gives you a decent brick. Hot water gives you a great one. That's the difference between my failed early batches and the ones that finally worked. Once it's a thick mush, you squeeze the water out, grab a handful, press it hard between your palms, or press it into any mold, an old loaf pan, a milk carton with the top cut off, even just squeezed into a rough ball by hand. Get as much water out as you possibly can. Then you set them somewhere dry and warm and you wait. In good sun or a warm, dry room, you'll have a hard, stove-ready brick in about 1 to 2 weeks. That's it. That's the whole everyday method. A bucket, water, garbage, and a little patience. No wood stove required to make them, and once you've got a shelf of them stacked, you've got heat in reserve that cost you nothing but the water bill. But I told you my early bricks failed, and I told you the answer was in the ratio. And that's the piece that separates a brick that crumbles from a brick that burns like my grandfather's. So let me give you what took me the longest to figure out. Here's the problem I kept running into. Pure paper pulp, all by itself, burns, but it burns a little sullen. It smolders, it makes more ash than I liked, and if you don't pack it perfectly, it falls apart when it dries. I knew there had to be something the old-timers added, because those crate bricks were dense and clean-burning and rock-solid. I went back through everything. And the clue, when I finally caught it, was sitting in plain sight in those old household descriptions from the war years. The families who did this best weren't using paper alone. They were mixing in one more free thing, sawdust. The mountain men and homesteaders who had this down to an art mixed their wet paper pulp with dry sawdust before they pressed the bricks. And the reason is beautiful once you see it. The paper pulp is the glue. When it dries, those broken down fibers lock together and hold everything in a solid mass. That's why you boiled it. But paper alone is dense and slow to catch. The sawdust is the fuel that gives the brick life. Sawdust is packed with the resins and quick-burning wood that make a fire jump and stay hot. Put them together, and the paper binds the sawdust into a solid log, while the sawdust gives the paper something hot and hungry to burn. One holds, one burns. Together they make something better than either one alone. The ratio the old accounts point to is roughly this: about 2 parts wet paper pulp to 1 part dry sawdust. You mix them right in the bucket until it's like thick oatmeal, then you press and dry them the same as before. That's the whole secret my grandfather never said out loud. 2 to 1, pulp to sawdust. That ratio is the difference between garbage and gold. And sawdust is everywhere, free for the asking. Any cabinet shop, any lumber yard, any fellow with a table saw in his garage will hand you a trash bag full and thank you for hauling it off. If you've ever cut a board in your own garage, you swept that fuel right into the dustpan and threw it out. I built a batch that way and it changed everything. The bricks came out heavy and hard and lit easy off a single match to a corner of paper. They burned clean, held their shape down to a small glowing core, and put out steady, even heat for well over an hour and a half apiece. Same as the ones in that crate. I finally, after 2 years, held in my hand exactly what my grandfather had been making on that stove when I was 9 years old. That was the moment the case cracked wide open. But there was one last piece, the piece that turns this from a neat trick into something that actually changes your winter, and it came from the oldest source I found. Here's the last clue, and it's the one that pulls the whole thing together. I mentioned that homestead thinking from Nessmuck's Woodcraft in 1884, the idea of getting maximum heat from minimum material. That principle led me to keep asking a sharper question. It's not just can you make fuel from garbage. It's how much fuel, and is it enough to actually matter on your heating bill? So I did the math on my own house, and I want you to sit with these numbers, because this is where it stops being a hobby. An average household throws out somewhere around a couple 100 pounds of paper and cardboard every single year. Junk mail alone, for a lot of homes, runs to dozens of pounds a year, mail you never asked for, that you carry from the mailbox straight to the trash. Add your cardboard, your newspaper, your paper packaging, and the toilet and towel tubes, and you are throwing away raw fuel week after week. Now here's the payoff. Those extension studies I found put the heat value of tightly packed, properly dried paper and sawdust bricks in the same range as soft firewood. So every brick you make is a brick of firewood you didn't have to buy. If a home burns through several racks of wood a winter at $40, $50, $60 a rack or worse, runs an electric or gas furnace, and watches the bill climb every month, then even replacing a portion of that with free bricks made from your own trash puts real money back in your pocket every single cold season. For some families I've talked to, it's the difference of a couple $100 a winter, every winter, for the rest of their lives. And that's the thing nobody selling you a furnace will ever tell you. The heat was there the whole time. It was in your recycling bin. It was in the sawdust you swept off your garage floor. It was in the roll of toilet paper under your sink and the cardboard tube at the center of it. The old mountain families knew that a man who can make his own heat can never be made cold by somebody else's price. That's what my grandfather meant, stirring that pot when I was a boy, making winter. He wasn't crazy. He was free. He was pulling next January's warmth out of this month's garbage, and he owed nobody a dime for it. So here's your finale, the whole method in one breath. The thing I spent 2 years digging out of old books in a dead man's shed so you don't have to. Soak your paper waste in warm water in a bucket overnight, or simmer it in a pot to break it down faster and better. Mash it to a thick pulp. Mix in about half as much dry sawdust, 2 parts pulp to 1 part sawdust. Squeeze every drop of water out and press it hard into a mold or a tight ball. Dry it a week or 2 in a warm spot, and you'll hold a brick that burns nearly 2 hours and costs you absolutely nothing. That is the trick they let die because it didn't sell anything. And now it's yours again. Let me leave you with this. What you just learned wasn't really about paper or sawdust or even the money, though the money is real. It's about the quiet feeling of knowing that if the price of heat doubles or the power goes out for a week or times just get lean the way they do, you are not helpless. You have a bucket, a pot, and a skill your great-grandparents would have recognized on sight. Somebody let that skill slip away from you. Tonight, you took it back. You're the kind of person who'd rather know how a thing works than trust a promise on a bill you can't read. That's why you made it to the end of this. That's who this is for. So here's what I want from you. Somewhere in your life there's a source of free sawdust, a lumber yard, a cabinet shop, a neighbor with a saw, maybe your own garage. I want you to tell me in the comments where you're going to get yours. Say it plain. I'm getting my sawdust from, and then where. I read these, and I want to see how many of you are actually going to make your first batch this month. Put it down in the comments right now, before you forget. And if you felt that old itch, the one that says there's a whole world of this knowledge that got buried on purpose, then come along with me. Subscribe and stand with the folks who are digging it all back up, one lost skill at a time. Because the next thing I'm chasing is even stranger than boiling toilet paper. It's an old mountain method for keeping a root cellar from freezing all winter using nothing but a single candle and a clay pot, and the science behind why it works is going to stop you cold. I've almost got it cracked. Don't miss it. Making winter, my friend. Go make yours. You made it all the way here with me, and that tells me you're serious. Inside the Mountain Man circle, I pick up right where this video stopped. The full fuel bricks method and the drying process I only touched on. Ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You're not alone in here. Just point your phone's camera at the code and cancel any time. Come join me.